Welcome to Creamer Media's Polity. I'm Brad Dubbelman. I'm in studio with political analyst Ebrahim Fakir to speak about the election of Zambian President Michael Sata and the implication of his election on the country and the region as a whole. Welcome, Ebrahim.
Thanks.
Recently, Zambia's long-serving President Rupiah Banda was unseated by opposition candidate Michael Sata. What implications does Sata's victory have for the country and the region as a whole?
Well, Bradley, I think we must first place in context where Michael Sata comes from. He's got a long history involved in Zambian politics, both as a civil servant as well as a political operator and political appointee. And he's worked in different parties and under different parties. But of course, since he's been in the PF, the party in which he's in, he's come to be known as a populist, but he's also developed a reputation of being able to actually get stuff done. So he's viewed both as a populist and a hard worker, but someone who can actually drive through and get changes to happen. So I think that's the background. So he does have some involvement in Zambian politics. For a long time also as an opposition political figure and political leader. Now, what implications this has for the country are several. I think his election comes at a time, firstly, when the civil society in Zambia is beginning to mobilize to a greater degree. And they were terribly unhappy under Rupiah Banda's leadership, because Rupiah Banda was particularly not a very open, charismatic, engaged leader. He was quite closed. There was very little civil involvement in shaping the way in which Zambia's governance and political governance regime and economic governance regime especially was going to be shaped. And I think there was a hope, somewhat misplaced perhaps, amongst civil actors that this populist actor may be slightly more engaged, will be more open, and will be more responsive to the way in which the civil sector in Zambia is going to clamor for certain things. And remember, one of the big campaign issues that he ran on in this presidential election was a populist ticket of serious economic change. Now, therein lies the second implication, beyond a greater hope that he will engage with civil society to a greater degree, but also that there may be some economic changes wrought. Now, how easy or how difficult he finds it to make those economic changes are going to remain to be seen. But what's the first thing he said once he was elected? Well, the first thing he started looking at was looking at Chinese investment in Zambia and saying that perhaps, while none of the contracts which exist with Chinese companies, especially in mining and in the extractive industries, are going to be reneged on, he did say that some of them will need to be renegotiated, and that will bring about its own implications. So where there's contracts which already stand in a particular country, it's very difficult to just go and renegotiate the terms of those contracts. And Sata's whole ticket was literally about economic decline in Zambia, about the levels of inequality, about the levels of poverty, and addressing those three things. Now, whether he's simply going to be able to address those three things simply by attacking the question of Chinese investment and extractive capacity of China, and of course the repatriation of profits and resources from Zambia outside of it, is going to remain to be seen, because that means that firstly you need to redevelop a regulatory framework. It also means that you have the capacity in the state to oversee that regulatory framework, and it also means that you can, in Parliament, drive through a change in law, a change in regulation. Now, interestingly, Zambia's political system is not a pure parliamentary or pure presidential system. Of course, they elect their president separately, but Sata's party does not enjoy an absolute and a whole majority in parliament. So they're not simply, and he's not simply going to be able to drive through massive regulatory, legal, and other changes as he might wish. So he may find that difficult. Where he might succeed, he may then find that there's no ability and there's no capacity in the state to be able to administer, execute, and oversee the way in which this happens. But let's wait it's very early days. That's the promise he came on. I suspect he may find it harder than he is assuming and harder than he has sold. And insofar as civil society in Zambia did in fact buy in to a Sata agenda, they may find over time like they had to turn against Banda, they may well turn against Sata if he's unable to drive some of these changes through, or the changes that he promised. So the China and the economic realm is the one. Arising out of the economic realm will also be his relationships with South Africa, because I think he's also been looking at South African investments, though he doesn't find those as distasteful as he may have found some of the Chinese ones. And there too, he'll be wanting to look at renegotiating how the terms of those investments occur and what kind of issues can be addressed with the South Africans who've invested there, whether it be in mining, whether it be in retail, in agriculture and in manufacturing to a small degree, because that's the primary, and banking of course, that's the primary sectors in which South Africans invest there. And that does require very serious regulatory change within Zambia's politics. And whether he can achieve that also will remain to be seen. When it comes to dealing with other states and other countries in the region, I think that he's going to find it more tricky, because insofar as there is a slightly better organized civil society and there's changes taking place across the continent and the region. In Botswana, for instance, you found not long ago there were massive strikes, whereas before there weren't such things. There's been a split in the ruling party, and who he chooses to cozy up to in a country like Botswana, which is one of its immediate neighbors, is going to be interesting to see. But that, I think, is going to be impacted on in the way in which you relate to Zambia, because to Zimbabwe, sorry, because remember, Botswana is not really cozy and friendly with Zimbabwe and with Robert Mugabe, and Michael Sata is going to have his work cut out defining how he's going to relate to Zimbabwe. So I think that's the kind of big issues that he's going to have to look at. But primarily and fundamentally, he's going to have to think very carefully about the economic ticket that he rode his presidency on, and how he's going to wreak those changes that he's promised that he wants to look at, because they're going to involve legal and regulatory changes, and then making sure that the state has the ability and the capacity to do so. And I think he'll find that he may be constrained in that regard.
Now, prior to the election of Sata, he was very critical of Chinese involvement in the country. Do you suspect that his victory, there will be a shift in China-Zambia relations?
Well, I think that shift, there's been evidence that he wishes to change the terms on which they relate. So I suppose minor shifts may happen. But this again has a history. And in the election, not the one we're just talking about, the one before that, in which Rupiah Banda actually won, and Sata was a candidate, he was an opposition candidate, China had actually made it quite explicit that they, and it's uncharacteristic for any country to be able to make such pronouncements, they made a pronouncement back then about what their unhappiness would be if Sata were elected the president. So this has a long history. One of the first things Sata did once he was elected as president of Zambia was met with the Chinese ambassador to try and look at renegotiating some of these, the terms of the Chinese investments. Now, as I said, I think it's going to be hard for him to simply change the terms on which they happen, because these things are contracted, they already exist. And quite importantly, in a policy terrain, Zambia doesn't have exchange controls. And that may be one of the first things he may have to look at. But how he's going to drive that through Parliament is going to be a different question. The problem with not having exchange controls is that those who are already operating in Zambia, whether in the extractive industries or elsewhere, can fairly easily repatriate large amounts of resources out the country. And that, I think, will be one of his primary things. Now, if he can push something like that through Parliament, if at all he wants to look at tinkering in the policy regime around exchange controls, that will fundamentally shift the way in which they relate to China, and at least to Chinese firms, because they'll be very unhappy about the fact that they simply can't now repatriate to the extent that they used to before. And it will force them to either reinvest those resources in Zambia, but that means that there needs to be sufficient diversity in the Zambian economy to make it worthwhile for Chinese to keep their money circulating in the Zambian economy, so that they can make enough on it. And of course that is not certain, because the Zambian economy is not terribly diverse. There may be efforts at diversification, which is one of the things Sata may start looking at, But how he stimulates that is going to be a different question. So he's going to have a serious task looking at what kind of policy instruments he's going to have to start using in order to stimulate certain different sectors of the economy away from just mining and away from just retail. And that's going to require looking at things like creating export processing zones, certain tax breaks, employment and job creation, upskilling in areas where you're going to need certain hard skills, and that takes a serious amount of time. So he's going to have to first think very carefully in policy terms what he wants to do, and then actually incept that policy, and that will take time. So whether that will impact on the way in which they can relate to China and fundamentally shift the nature of the relationship, I'm not sure that's going to happen pretty soon. But he's already made, let's say, gestures, if you want to call it that he'd like to change the terms on which they relate to China. China, on the other hand, would not be that impressed that he's been elected, given what they said in the previous election. But they're going to have to bite the bullet and accept that this is the guy they're going to have to work with. How they work with him, of course, remains to be seen. They haven't yet given any indications for how they're going to deal with Zambia. But I suspect that's because they have different eyes on different horizons across different parts of the continent. So Zambia may well become less a flavor for China to continue investing in. They may just simply make the decision that whatever exists is what we will continue with, and we'll start looking elsewhere. It's not as if they have a shortage of countries in which they're looking to make serious investments. I mean, our president was just there 2 weeks ago, and so, you know, the South African economy is a much bigger apple to look at than Zambia currently is. So from the Chinese perspective, they may decide, well, there's a new guy, we'll work with him on the terms that he wants, but we'll start looking elsewhere. So, you know, relationships are always premised on two parties. One party may wish for a fundamental shift, and the other party may simply decide to look away and pursue other opportunities while continuing with what they have that exists. And I think that is what will characterize their relationship. I don't think it will get any more adversarial than the tensions that have emerged. And there won't be a complete breakdown, because Sata will come to realize that insofar as he needs to keep the Zambian economy ticking over and growing even further, the ability to attract other investments is not going to be that easy. And so to keep the Zambian economy ticking over, he'll have to continue some level of relationship with China, even in its current form.
Now, you've touched on it, but how will SARTA's victory affect relations within the SADC bloc, and in particular with Zimbabwe?
Well, I think the Zimbabwe one is going to be interesting, and that's going to be premised on how he relates to Botswana. Not as if Botswana is a key regional influence which is massive, but nevertheless, it is an immediate neighbor. Zambia is a landlocked country, so is Botswana. They're reliant on other countries for transportation, for getting goods and services in, and using those countries' ports, and relationships with those countries are therefore going to be very important. How the rest of SADC relates to Zambia, to Zambia and to Zimbabwe, I think will determine the tenor of the way in which Sata himself would premise Zambia's relations with Zimbabwe. Botswana is going to be one factor, but quite importantly, the DRC and South Africa are also going to be serious factors in the way in which he premises his relationships with Zimbabwe. Insofar as a populist, he might believe that some of Mugabe's policies are in fact quite good. He may find that in Zambia, they may not find as much resonance as he thinks they might, because the Zambian population, I think, has shown that it wants to push for both higher levels of development without necessarily sacrificing high levels of democracy. So if he believes that he might be able to push through certain policies in a way which is closed, which is not inclusive, which is not consultative, and which is not responsive to the way in which Zambian society would like it to be seen, that he's going to find it very hard to do so, and that the people may in fact in another election reject him. So he's going to have to be quite careful what kind of things he adopts from the Zimbabwean model, and he's also going to have to be quite careful how he constructs Zambia's relationship with Zimbabwe, considering what South Africa, the DRC, and other important players in SADC are going to do in relation to Zimbabwe. And as we know, the Zimbabwean situation has remained locked and in stasis for quite some time, in spite of this government of national unity. And Sata may well decide that he'll play both sides of the divide, depending on how this thing is going to play out within Zimbabwe itself. Because I think the Zimbabwe situation is so complex and is so incredibly on a knife edge, because the reality is that one never knows quite what is going to happen once Mugabe is out of power. Once Mugabe is out of power, either by an act of God or whether his party asks him to go after the next election, whenever they have it, there may well be splits and factions within ZANU-PF itself, which will have individuals clamoring for who should replace Mugabe. And that's notwithstanding the kind of noises and pressures that will come from two opposition parties who may also want a piece of this pie. So Sata is going to have to look not just at what's going on currently in Zimbabwe, but he's going to have to look to a future, because his presidency starts now only. And what might change in Zimbabwe may actually happen in the next year or two. And that may change the nature of the way in which he relates to Zimbabwe. But I think he'll take his cue from the other big players in SADC, primarily South Africa, DRC, and to a degree, depending on what Angola and Tanzania might also say with regard to Zimbabwe. So I think it's not easy for him, and I think it's going to be very difficult for him to simply premise a relationship with Zimbabwe simply on his own whims. And importantly, China is a factor. China is a factor because China has reasonably good relations with Zimbabwe. And if they are seriously developing tensions, and if they get worse than they currently are, which I don't suspect they will, then that will flavor the way in which he will deal with Zimbabwe. But I think that's on the longer term horizon. I think he would be well advised, and I think this is what he will do. He'll start taking a slightly more insular look at what he actually has to do in Zambia, rather than what he's going to have to do in relation to Zambia's partners in China or elsewhere in SADC.
Please outline some of the key challenges facing Zambia and Sata's government going forward.
Well, I think he's identified some of these, and I think we know them all. The first is the question of inequality and how he's going to address this question of inequality, because that's the ticket he rode on. Second is the question of investments and the terms in which people invest in Zambia. So there he's going to have to look firstly at the terms and renegotiating some of them, which he's going to find very hard. He will, of course, also have to find a way of dealing with a parliament in which his party does not enjoy a complete majority, and they simply can't ram through policy or legislation that they may like. Third is in the area of state capacity, how he's going to have to reshape the nature of the Zambian state, which is characterized at the moment by weak civil service, low levels of state capacity, deep regulatory fissure which is going to have to fix. And then he'll have to start flowing from that at a policy regime, how he's going to have to incept certain policies to reduce inequality, diversify the economy, change the terms of trade and investment in Zambia. And then, one of the things I highlighted was the question of exchange controls. He'll have to look at whether he wants to introduce those or not, and if he does, after such a long period, what kind of impact that might have on the Zambian economy. If the whiff amongst serious investors in Zambia, and there aren't that many to speak of, are that they may be constrained, if there are going to be exchange controls, they may, before that is actually incepted, repatriate whatever it is they have, and the Zambian economy is then going to suffer a decline. So he'll have to start from scratch. So he's going to have very serious thinking around policy and what kind of policy he puts in place, because policy is not just about how you frame a law and how it will operate. It is also about how will it affect people and companies and firms' behavior in a society, and if that behavior on a cost-benefit analysis over time is going to be detrimental, then you have to be very incremental. So he's going to have very serious policy thinking to do. And then lastly, I think it's in the area of civil society and how open, engaged and responsive he can afford to remain if he wants to be successful as a president, because I think he'll come to realize that once you're in government, being as responsive, open and engaging is not always possible if you simply want to drive through and see changes happen. And given the tenor that he comes from, which is that he simply wants to get stuff done, I suspect over time he may be much less engaging and much less open than he currently appears to be. So I think those are the 5 big areas: inequality in the economy, building the state, looking at policy and regulatory change, dealing with Zambia's external relations, and then dealing with internal relations in parliament and with civil society.
That was Ebrahim Fakir speaking about the recent election of Zambia's President Michael Sata.